So what phonics should we teach? Well, there are two kinds of phonics, analytic and synthetic phonics. I'd like to assess them in terms of which work best in native environments, and then talk about how they can be modified to an EFL context. In analytic phonics, children memorize some initial written words and then soon begin reading simple texts. The phonics element focuses on developing awareness of the connection between letters and the placement in words. Teachers often introduce sounds by eliciting student responses, such as, do you know any words that begin with cat, or cabbage? Right? This, of course, draws on an already extant vocabulary. Teaching then moves on to focus on sounds at the end of words, followed by CDC word forms, the blending of sounds, as in BL and BR to bull and burr, and finally digraphs, such as SH and CH, sh and ch. The defining characteristic of analytic phonics is that the students are trained in how to analyze words that they already know for representative sounds. This requires a certain level of preparatory memorization work before the phonics program can be implemented. In synthetic phonics, the children learn a few initial letter sounds. Then they are shown immediately how to blend those sounds to form words. This also has the effect of rendering unnecessary later focus on blending of sounds, because things like CL and SL would just be blended naturally, instead of having to learn it as a set block of letters. These would be read as part of the overall principle of breaking sounds. I would also point out that it's important when you're teaching this method that to be careful of how you pronounce the sounds of the letters yourself, because sometimes the convention for pronouncing a letter isn't always the best way to teach it. For instance, for the sound of C, we might say "k," as C is "k." But to an EFL student, the difference between "k" and "k" is very large. And when they're trying to blend those sounds together to form a word, if they've learned "k," "b," then they could say like "cat" is "k-at" instead of "cat." So when we're teaching the sounds, it sometimes helps to train ourselves a little bit to how we pronounce the letter, to make it a sharp, clear sound, like k-at, cat. Yeah. It's much easier for the students to understand. Once students have a repertoire of about 5 sounds, they can start reading simple decodable books. Especially if appropriate picture books are properly used, this can mediate difficult grammatical or vocabulary explanations. And I intend to elaborate more a little bit on which books are appropriate and how to use them a bit later. Now, to continue with the synthetic phonics here, as soon as the students start reading, they are introduced to phonetically irregular or sight words as they come up. Although these words must be memorized, the teacher makes sure that children are aware of the phonetic cues to pronounce them. For instance, the letter R in R, as in "we are happy," is a clue as to how the word is pronounced. Or perhaps the letter U in Y-O-U, U, like A-U. It's a key to how it's pronounced, so you would draw the students to that feature of the word. Finally, the critical difference is this. New written words are not taught as they are introduced. They must be decoded by the student first. The teacher only plays a supporting role in perhaps reminding the students of the pronunciation of individual letters, and maybe assisting them in blending practice. Once the student can produce the word, then the teacher can move in to further support the acquisition of meaning or to clarify precise pronunciation. So which method is best? Well, Johnson and Watson compared analytic, synthetic, and mixed phonics programs in Clackmannanshire, Scotland. I think it is one of the broadest studies of its kind to date. They measured reading ability over the first 3 years of school using standardized reading instruments. They measured isolated word reading, spelling, and reading comprehension. Of course, this research was conducted in a native English environment. The results showed that the synthetic group was 7 years ahead of their age level in word reading and spelling. The analytic group was average. I just want to emphasize that. 7 years is huge. For a child in 3rd grade to be reading and writing words at a 10th grade level is, I think, amazing. For a whole class to do so is something which I think should make us all sit up and take notice. The synthetic group was also better at reading irregular words. And despite the criticism of phonics programs by whole language advocates, the results also show that reading comprehension was also improved. Even more surprising was that the synthetics program the synthetic phonics program effectively eliminated the gender gap in reading ability. Traditionally, girls have tended to read at a higher level than boys in native-speaking countries, but perhaps the systematic, constructive nature of the synthetic model appeals to boys in some way that other methods do not. They also found that the synthetic program eliminated the proficiency gap for students from economically disadvantaged environments. And this is also probably due to the fact that the disadvantaged students benefited from learning explicit rules, whereas children from more well-to-do families tend to have more exposure to reading before they enter school, and thus have traditionally had a greater advantage over their less advantaged peers. Now, although this research was conducted on native speakers in Scotland, we can see a similar phenomenon in Japan, in the so-called Juku kids. These are children from better-off families who can afford to go to tutoring after school for a variety of subjects. My experience has shown that synthetic phonics has been effective in narrowing the achievement gap between those students and the students who don't have that kind of exposure to English outside of the classroom. And it's enabling those kids to come up and be more involved in classes. Also supporting this is a study done in America in 2000, where they reviewed academic research on reading and writing to come up with a consensus on how reading should be taught in public schools. What they found was that systematic synthetic phonics programs benefit both children beginning school and older students with reading difficulties. They also found that synthetic phonics helps improve reading comprehension, as did Johnson and Watson. They called it a valuable and essential part of a successful classroom reading program, but they qualified this by stating that phonics is a means and not an end. And I'd like to emphasize this point as well. Too often I've seen phonics introduced into reading programs as an isolated and unrelated skill, which is taught simply as a system of memorizing sounds for letters. This just becomes another set of designations for characters that students have to learn alongside the alphabet. The goal of phonics is reading. It is not to learn phonics. Divorced from an integrated reading program, phonics is of questionable value. But integrated into a reading program, it is invaluable. So how should we teach phonics? Well, I think this has shown that it should be synthetic phonics, if we were going to teach it at all. Instruction must be explicit, and all of the surveys agree on this one. The children have to know why they are learning these sounds. They have to be shown how they can use these sounds to form words. And they have to know why they should even want to bother being able to read in English. These are all things which young students need to be guided to see, and we can't assume that they will have already thought of them. There needs to be a systematic, logical sequence. The teacher needs to know why they are introducing the letter sounds in the order they are. Preferably, the sequence should enable the students to start reading simple picture books as soon as possible. Since reading materials vary according to circumstance, I find it useful to select a sequence of reading materials and to fit the sequence to the targeted texts. I personally use readingatoz.com's series of decodable readers because I like the way they use simplified pictures to accurately portray the text. However, there are a number of alternative sequences on the market, and there is no single set prescribed order to teaching the letter sounds. However, I would argue that the alphabetic order is perhaps the least useful. The goal of whatever sequence you choose should be to form as many words as possible, as soon as possible, and the alphabetic system doesn't seem well adapted to that. Whatever the program, it must be consistent. Phonics instruction is usually completed within the first 2 years of English instruction in a native environment. But due to constraints of time and exposure, this is not feasible in a public school foreign language program. Consequently, reading needs to be charted out over the duration of a child's elementary school exposure, and this pattern needs to be consistent and maintained throughout the duration of their participation. Each new sound should be added to a repertoire of previously learned ones. Students then need to meet complexity in accordance with their cognitive development. Inconsistency in a reading program can confuse and demoralize the students. If that happens, it can potentially undermine future attempts at instruction and possibly create a long-lasting aversion to language study in general, something which we don't want to avoid.